Over 60% of completely normal people would voluntarily administer a lethal electrical shock to a stranger just because a guy in a lab coat told them to. Why? Well, because the line between a quote-unquote good person and a monster isn't a personality trait. It's actually a biological glitch.
It really is.
If you're obsessed with the why behind human behavior and the dark side of the mind, you are in the right place. Hit subscribe and turn on that bell to join us. We drop deep dives like this every week to help you outsmart the average. Now, let's get into the data.
Yeah, let's do it. What's fascinating here is that we all desperately want to believe the world is neatly divided. Like there's this thick permanent wall separating the moral, upstanding citizens from the irredeemable monsters out there.
Right, exactly. Like if you're watching a true crime doc on a Friday night, it feels really safe to just assume that dark actions come from fundamentally dark souls.
Absolutely. But our mission for this deep dive is to look at a much more unsettling reality. What we're finding in the neuroscience and the psychology of dark human behavior is that this line between good and bad is, well, it's incredibly thin.
Extremely thin.
Right. We are analyzing how everyday people, people with families, jobs, hobbies, can end up committing terrible acts. We aren't looking at this as some rare genetic mutation. It's more like an administrative failure of the brain.
So evil isn't this pathological anomaly. It's basically what happens when our biological shortcuts get hijacked by our environment.
That is the core of it, yeah. We're looking at psychological mechanisms, things like cognitive dissonance or empathy switches in the brain that can literally be toggled on and off. And these mechanisms reside in every single human brain.
Which means for you listening right now, understanding these hidden frameworks isn't just some abstract academic exercise. It might fundamentally change how you view history or how you judge the news, and most importantly, your own daily decisions.
Exactly. The machinery is always running in the background. The real question is who or what is at the controls.
Okay, let's unpack this. If we want to understand how ordinary people commit dark acts, we have to ask where the behavior actually comes from, right?
Yeah.
Like, is it built into their personality or is it drawn out by the situation?
Well, this brings us to what psychologists call the person-situation debate. Humans have a really strong bias toward dispositional explanations.
Meaning we blame the person's character.
Right. If someone does something bad, we assume they just have a bad character. It's comforting because it means we are immune. But the science paints a vastly different picture. When you put ordinary people into certain environments, the situation frequently overpowers the soul entirely.
Wow.
Yeah. The most famous illustration of this in our sources is Philip Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment.
Oh, I've definitely heard of this one. But let's break down the mechanics of what actually went down in that basement.
So the research team took a group of totally normal, psychologically healthy university students. They rigorously screened them, to make sure no one had underlying issues or violent tendencies.
Makes sense.
And then they randomly assigned them to play either guards or prisoners in a makeshift basement prison.
Wait, literally just a coin flip?
A literal flip of a coin. You're a guard, you're a prisoner. These were just everyday kids. But within just a few days, the students playing the guards became highly abusive. Authoritarian, cruel. They stripped the prisoners, subjected them to psychological torture, disrupted their sleep.
That is wild.
It escalated so quickly and so violently that a 2-week experiment had to be shut down after just 6 days.
It's terrifying how fast that shift happened. It makes me think about a much more common scenario like getting behind the wheel of a car.
Oh, that's a great example.
Right. You know someone who is mild-mannered, holds the door open, always says please and thank you. But the second they get into rush hour traffic, they become a raging monster, just screaming at other drivers. The environment, the metal box, the anonymity, it completely changes the rules.
Yeah. The car provides a new context and a degree of separation from consequences. In the Stanford experiment, the artificial power dynamic demanded a new social order. To understand why their brains allowed this cruelty, we have to look at a concept called de-individuation.
De-individuation.
Okay.
So losing your individual self. But how does that physically happen? Do they just forget who they are?
No, they aren't forgetting. Their brain is actively reallocating resources. When you join a group, or especially when you put on a uniform like the khaki uniforms and mirrored sunglasses the guards wore, your individual identity dissolves into the collective.
Interesting.
Neurobiologically, there's a network in the brain called the default mode network, or the DMN. This area is highly active when we are reflecting on ourselves, our values, our personal memories. It's basically the seat of your moral compass.
Okay, so what happens to that network when you put on the uniform?
Well, the DMN requires immense cognitive resources to reflect on morals. When you are thrust into a high-stress, rule-bound environment, your brain senses that survival now depends on group cohesion, not individual reflection.
It just shuts it down.
It literally reroutes blood flow and glucose away from the DMN and into the amygdala and motor cortex for immediate survival and pattern matching. You aren't just taking a backseat mentally, your brain is actively starving your moral center of energy.
Why?
It stops asking, is this right for me to do? And instead asks, is this what my group does in this situation?
Okay, so the uniform strips away the self to protect the group, but that only explains passive conformity, right? In the real world, atrocities usually have an architect, someone actually giving direct orders. If my self is dissolved, does my brain just unquestioningly adopt the moral code of whoever is in charge?
It doesn't just adopt it, it actively rewrites reality to accommodate it. Stanley Milgram realized this when he conducted his famous obedience study. He wanted to know how ordinary citizens could participate in the horrors of World War II.
Right. Was it a cultural flaw or just human nature? But how do you test that ethically? You can't exactly recreate a dictatorship in a lab.
True. So Milgram did something arguably just as devious. He set up a fake learning experiment. A participant arrives and is told they'll act as a teacher. In the next room, a learner, who is actually an actor, is strapped to an electrode.
Okay.
An authority figure, this stern man in a gray lab coat, tells the teacher to administer a shock every time the learner gets a question wrong. And with every wrong answer, the voltage increases all the way up to a lethal 450 volts.
Hearing a stranger scream in pain through a wall, I mean, you would think anyone would just stand up and walk out the door.
Milgram actually surveyed psychiatrists before the experiment. They predicted that maybe 0.1%, like true psychopaths, would go all the way to the maximum voltage.
And the actual data.
Over 60% of the participants went all the way to the final, supposedly lethal voltage. Even as the actor screamed, banged on the wall, complained of a heart condition, and eventually went totally silent, 60% of everyday people kept pressing the button.
I cannot wrap my head around that. How does the human brain actually justify doing that in the moment? Because the guy didn't even threaten them, right?
No threat at all. He simply said, the experiment requires that you continue.
That is insane. 60% is most people.
Yeah.
That could be me, that could be you. What is the mental gymnastics required to press a button knowing you are inflicting agonizing pain and then just go home and eat dinner?
The brain survives the dissonance through a process called moral disengagement.
Moral disengagement.
Yeah. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the brain is an absolute master at reframing reality to protect the ego. One of the primary tools here is euphemistic labeling. We change the words we use so the action fundamentally ceases to feel immoral.
Give me an example.
Instead of the brain processing the thought, I am electrocuting an innocent person, it processes, I am fulfilling a protocol. Or in corporate scandals, it's not I'm stealing from pensioners, it's I'm optimizing market share.
So language becomes a shield.
It's more than a shield, it's like an active hallucinogen. The language fundamentally shifts how the brain's visual and emotional centers process the person on the other side of the wall. They stop being human. They become a task, an obstacle to completing the objective.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. We've talked about the psychological tricks, how roles starve the DMN, how euphemistic labeling reframes cruelty. But psychological concepts can feel kind of abstract. I want to look under the hood. Is there a literal physical mechanism in the brain that makes this dehumanization possible?
There is, and it's heavily localized in the prefrontal cortex.
Yeah.
This is the area right behind your forehead, responsible for complex decision-making and empathy. When you see someone stub their toe, your prefrontal cortex helps you simulate their experience. You physically wince because your brain is mirroring their pain.
Right, that visceral reaction where you immediately feel bad for them.
Exactly. Well, neuroscientists have discovered a biological empathy gap using fMRI machines. When we look at someone in our in-group family, friends, the prefrontal cortex lights up brightly. But when subjects are shown images of people they've been primed to see as an outsider or an enemy,
Let me guess. The activity drops.
it shows significantly decreased activity. Sometimes it barely registers at all. We literally, on a neurological level, fail to process them as fully human.
Wait. I have to push back here. So you're saying the brain literally stops registering their pain. Are we just biologically hardwired to be cruel to anyone outside our immediate circle? Because that sounds really bleak.
It's a crucial distinction. We are not hardwired for cruelty. We're hardwired for efficiency.
Efficiency.
Think of the prefrontal cortex like a smartphone's battery saver mode. Empathy takes a massive amount of cognitive calories to run. When you are around your in-group, the phone is plugged into the wall. Empathy is running at full power.
Because it's safe to expend that energy.
Precisely. But when the brain perceives an outsider, it senses a potential threat. If early humans spent all their energy empathizing deeply with a rival tribe competing for water, their own children might die. So the brain automatically turns on low power mode. It shuts down empathy to allocate processing power to defense.
So it's literally just a survival mechanism. It takes actual calories to care, and the brain is just being stingy to keep us alive.
It's a dark evolutionary relic. The problem is our modern world is incredibly complex and diverse, but we are still operating with that ancient hardware. The brain's natural inclination to categorize people into us versus them and turn on battery saver mode, it's an automatic reflex.
Which means we can't just trust our gut. Our gut is running on software from 100,000 years ago.
And that is the crucial takeaway. We are not doomed by this biology, but we do have to actively, consciously fight against it. We have to use our higher order reasoning to override the empathy gap.
So what does this all mean? If our social structures reroute blood flow away from our moral centers, and language acts as a hallucinogen, and our biology throws our empathy into low power mode, how do we protect ourselves? How do we stay on the quote-unquote good side of that line?
The defense mechanism found across the research is called the 1% decision framework.
The 1% decision.
Yeah. The slide into dark behavior isn't usually a sudden leap. It's a gradual slope of small concessions. So the defense must also be in everyday choices. The core principle is prioritizing individual accountability over group consensus.
Okay, make this tangible for me. How does this look in practice?
Let's look at a classic corporate boardroom. Imagine you're on a product development team for an auto manufacturer. You notice a defect in the braking system. It's rare, but it could lead to accidents.
High stakes, but pretty standard problem solving.
Now watch the psychology unfold. The product manager says, if we delay the launch to fix this, we miss targets and lose millions. The defect only happens in 0.1% of cases. Then the euphemistic labeling begins.
Ah, right.
A colleague says, well, it's within acceptable tolerance limits. Another says, it's a user-mitigated anomaly.
The hallucinogen kicks in. Suddenly, they aren't talking about car crashes. They're talking about anomalies.
Exactly. And notice what's happening to your brain in that room. The DMN is being starved. You are de-individuating into the team player role. The potential victims are abstracted into data points. Your prefrontal cortex empathy drops. If you stay silent, you've taken the first step down the slope.
So where does the 1% decision come in?
It is the micro moment of friction. It's the conscious, uncomfortable choice to force your brain out of battery saver mode. You deliberately break the euphemistic labeling and say, wait, acceptable tolerance means we are knowingly putting a family in a car that might not brake on a rainy highway.
You force the human element back into the room.
You force the DMN to power back up. You rehumanize the data point. It's a tiny 1% shift in the trajectory of the meeting. You might get pushback, but that tiny moment disrupts the group consensus.
It's catching the exact second the language shifts from human beings to tasks.
Exactly. Catching the moment you feel the relief of letting the group make a hard choice for you.
Refusing to let the environment dictate your moral energy. Speaking up in those tiny moments today builds the neural pathways that prevent horrific acts tomorrow.
The moment you understand how the machinery works, the labels, the energy shifts, you gain the power to manually override it.
That is incredibly empowering. It takes the mystery out of it. Dark actions aren't some mystical force. They're just biological shortcuts left unchecked.
Completely.
So if you realize today that your empathy can be hacked by a simple uniform or a specific phrase, you are only halfway there. Because the way social media algorithms use this exact same biology actually determines if you have any free will online at all. Watch our breakdown on the digital outrage machine right here to complete the puzzle.